to our webinar. I'm Cristina Talaco, the Chair of Coalition for Conservation, and I'll be your moderator tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This is our second webinar on the UK Conservative leadership on climate. In June, we launched our series with former Prime Minister David Cameron, and next month, on the 2nd of September, we're having an exclusive webinar with former Prime Minister Theresa May, who will be joined by New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian. So please keep the date in your diaries, as this will be a great opportunity to hear from these two outstanding female leaders. But tonight we have the privilege of having with us two outstanding gentlemen, the chairman of the UK Climate Change Committee and former Secretary for the Environment, Lord Dibben, with our C4C ambassador, former Minister for the Environment, Senator Robert Hill. C4C has been working closely to the UK Conservatives because they have championed a very strong climate and environment agenda into their leadership for the past 3 decades. In 2008, they introduced the Climate Change Act, and they created the Independent Climate Change Committee. Last year, Theresa May announced that the UK would abandon their original emissions reduction target of 80% by 2050 to pursue a target of net zero. Now, the event tonight will be a conversation with our panelists, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions, so please type them on the Q&A function on your screen. And there's also a chat box where you can type comments and interact with the guests. So I'll kick off by asking Lord Dibben a first question. John, I'll call you John tonight. Good morning, and it's so wonderful to have you here, joining from the UK. John, it's somewhat surprising for Australians, as you know, to see how the Conservatives in the UK managed to get that level of bipartisanship in the area of climate and in the environment. Could you please tell us a little bit about the history, how the Conservatives set the foundations and continue to be the leaders in conservation?
Well, we don't find it at all surprising because, after all, the word conservative and the word conservation come from the same basis. And historically, almost every major change of an environmental kind in history has been done by Conservative governments, from Disraeli cleaning up the water in the rivers, right the way through to the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So we don't find it surprising at all. What we find surprising is that the Australians don't do the same thing. That's the odd thing for us. So this is a particular example, though, because it has been, right from the beginning, a cross-party matter. I mean, I proved that because as a long-term Conservative minister, 16 years as a Conservative minister, I was chosen as chairman of the Climate Change Committee by the Socialist First Minister of Wales, the Scottish Nationalist First Minister of Scotland, the Protestant Unionist First Minister of the North of Ireland, and the Liberal Democrat in the coalition government to be the new chairman of the committee. So you understand, I'm a Conservative and a Catholic, so it was quite surprising that that should have gone together. But it all started really because the shadow Conservative Minister for the Environment, Peter Ainsworth, who is the great hero of this, recognised that we had to have a Climate Change Act and worked with Friends of the Earth to produce it. And he then got the Conservative Party and David Cameron to agree to this. And then he went to all the opposition parties, including the Protestant Unionists, and got them all to sign that they would support this act. And then he went to the Labour Party and said, we don't want this to be a partisan act. And we know that there are 100 Labour members of Parliament at least who will join us in this. But we don't want it to be divisive. So we want you to introduce it as a government act. And after a good deal of shuffling around and being told by the Treasury this wasn't a good idea, the Labour government then introduced it. So right from the beginning, it was a cross-party act, and it has remained like that. And I sit as a Conservative, in the House of Lords, but I vote as an independent because that's the way you have to do it, and it's the proper way. And it does work. the only danger with it is that because you have consensus, sometimes that leads to complacency. So it's very important for the government to be pushed even further by the opposition. And so far, that's exactly what's happened.
Wonderful. Well, but was there any, at any stage, was there any sort of internal divisions within the Tories on climate, or was it easy to convince?
Well, to start with, there was a majority for doing these things, and there was a minority of people who thought, well, we better go along with it, and a very small number of adamant denialists. And we still have some of those. I mean, they sit now, most of them in the House of Lords, and I have to listen to Peter Lilly, for example, who was a minister and who is a denialist, and he still puts forward the same things which really the science never did support, but now can't support. But there is that little stream in conservatism in Britain, which is a kind of a stream which looks to America, I think a very dangerous attitude, and which actually believes some of the nonsense which the American right puts forward. But it's a very small group, and I'm happy to say that so far we've been able to overcome it.
Well, thanks, John. Let's find out from Robert what the experience was in Australia in comparison to the UK. Robert, welcome. You there? And thank you for your support to C4C as our ambassador. In light of what we heard from John, can you tell us a bit about the experience in Australia? You were Minister for the Environment. Why do you think the experience with climate policy here has been so different to the UK?
Well, if we go back to the convention, both sides of Australian politics were in favour of it. In fact, the whole world was in favour of it. The convention, late 80s, negotiated in a record short period of time, adopted at the Rio conference, 1990, very quickly ratified all around the world, including by the United States. And President Bush, the senior, gave a powerful speech at Rio in favour of it. Both sides of Australian politics were, on the same book. And as the years have gone by, the debate between the parties has not been so much about differences in principle, but differences in implementation. And I always thought that this was going to be the challenge. The issue for implementing the Climate Change Convention globally has been fairness between states in terms of economic consequences, and within nations, fairness between different interests and different communities. And that remains so today. So the big squabble in Australian politics has really been the issue of whether you achieve your outcome through a tax or a cap system, or whether you do it through other measures. And it's still the issue. It's not just an issue within the coalition, but it's been a big issue for Labor as well. And it remains a major issue today, because if we did have a cap, we would at least know what the outcome would be. We would know where we would be in a certain time, and have confidence that the policies and measures would actually achieve that outcome. That's our challenge still today.
Yeah, well, let's fast forward a bit to today then. We're living this historic human and economic crisis with COVID, where both our governments have been announcing unprecedented financial aid to stimulate our economies and save the jobs. John, you wrote the foreword on the Net Zero publication that put forward recommendations ranging from emissions reductions, economic incentives, and new technologies. Can you tell us about the steps the UK will take to rebuild from COVID, and how it may accelerate the transition to a net zero economy or not, and improve climate resilience?
Well, what a big question. The fact of the matter is that it is pretty widely accepted in Britain that there is no way out of COVID-19 except the way towards resilience. To go back in some way is clearly not sensible, and the government has accepted that. And in the early decisions which it's made, it has certainly followed the proposals of the Climate Change Committee. Of course, people never do exactly what you want, and they never move quite as fast as you'd want them to do. But the government in general has certainly done what it should do, and has been supported by the opposition. The opposition, perfectly rightly, has been pushing it to do more. Well, I like that. That's exactly what one's in this for. And if there were a Labour government, I'd be pushing the Tories to be doing more. But for example, the government has taken on board the fact that we are going to live in a different world. People are going to work from home. They are going to need, therefore, to have better broadband all over the country. So very practical things like that are part of the government's programme. Secondly, we're going to have to find new jobs for people, and one of the areas where it is most sensible to do that is in the insulation and updating of homes, in order to reduce the emissions, but at the same time to make people more comfortable and have much lower energy bills. So that's a very major part of what the government has already set out to do. And then there's the question too of thinking differently about your priorities. And so the government has been planning for a whole series of changes. The standards of new homes has been very low in Britain, and very often those standards haven't been reached. The government is expected to bring forward some much higher building standards. We're waiting for what those will be. The Climate Change Committee has suggested the level that they should be, and that of course will mean that new homes will be fit for purpose and not have to be renovated as the previous level meant. So those changes. And then we've seen a shift from spending money on roads to improving cycle lanes and encouraging people to walk, so that you get more people out on their own feet in one way or another and reduce the amount of emissions put into the air. And then we've seen a whole series of other individual cases, so that in every action that the government has been doing, they have been encouraged to, and in most points have, done the greens, taken the green route. Now, if you're passionate about it and understand exactly what we need to do, no government ever moves fast enough. So you have to push all the time. But now, of course, we're in a different position from Australia, because taking up your former minister's comment, and I so much agree with him, what you have to do is to have a framework which people feel safe with. Now, in Britain, because we are committed by law to meeting this target in 2050, we're also committed by law to be meeting the budgets for carbon reduction all the way through to the middle of the 2030s. And at the end of this year, we will be producing the 6th of these budgets. The Climate Change Committee produces these budgets every 5 years, and that will take us almost to 2040. When Parliament discusses those budgets and votes on it and makes those budgets the legally binding budgets, it can't be changed without the Climate Change Committee's permission. So that means everybody knows what point we have to reach by which year, and the government would be taken to court if it doesn't. So it's an entirely objective system now, so that every businessman, everybody building anything, anybody thinking about the future, knows precisely what they are going to have to do at a particular time in the future, right the way up to nearly 2040. So that's the big thing that the Climate Change Act has done. It has been to give Parliament the opportunity to vote far enough ahead for them to be objective and not think about what Mrs. Jones down the road thinks for tomorrow, far enough ahead to fix a budget which can't be changed, and which means, therefore, that everybody knows where they are, which is a pretty conservative concept. In other words, tell people where they've got to be and let them get on with finding the ways of doing it.
Yeah. We don't have a climate change act here, as you know, and we don't have the climate change committee, but I'm pretty confident that the government will integrate green initiatives, renewables in our post-COVID stimulus packages. So, Robert, what have you been hearing from business and from investors? Because it seems that it's happening in the corporate side of the world, even though the government hasn't yet talked about a green stimulus. But what are your thoughts on Australia integrating green initiatives?
Well, it's been interesting that within government, just observing the process the government set up for its economic renewal post-COVID, there has certainly not been the green emphasis that we've seen in Europe, for example. It's in many ways it's been how do we restore the old business, you know, in a more modern environment. Part of the debate is really about, you know, we were brought up on cheap energy. That was our competitive advantage in Australia. How can we reduce the price of gas so that we can restore Australian manufacturing? It's the psyche is very different to the European psyche. Angus Taylor would say, but I'm complementing that through my technology roadmap initiative, which he sees as the basis of his long-term strategy for responding to the climate change challenge, and that involves a whole lot of technologies of the future. So he would argue that he is looking to that post-COVID economic future will include, in terms of meeting a commitment that the government has to keep reducing carbon emissions, will be very much orientated to new technological opportunities that are low carbon opportunities. But what you say is interesting because business is changing. There's still business from the old world, but there's a lot of business from the new world, which is now in some ways being more demanding of government in terms of what it wishes to see in this area than what government is yet responding to in Australia. So, you know, government's not silly. They do listen to their supporters. And over time, I think that will influence government policy towards the greener side more so than it has in the past.
Mm. Yeah, so the large companies like Qantas, BHP, Rio, they're all taking steps to a net zero by 2050. So there's these two different realities between government and business. But why do you actually think corporations are ahead of the game? Is it something to do with them understanding better that stranded assets and environmental risks are no longer accepted? And it's a bit harder for government to catch up and set up this framework?
Well, I think that the government is doing, I think that the business is doing extremely well compared with governments. And the thing that worries me, and I'd like to ask Robert about this myself, what I don't understand about what's happening in Australia, and I've been twice relatively recently to talk about these issues, what I don't understand is the entire lack of urgency. I mean, all this conversation is as if climate change is going to wait for the Australians to find it convenient. And the truth is, it isn't going to. And here are these great Australian companies and international companies working in Australia themselves saying, for our good, for the good of our companies, for the good of our investors, indeed, in order to have investors, we've actually got to make these big changes. And yet the Australian government seems to talk as if, well, one way or another, it'll all work out okay, and we'll do it at our own pace. And one of the worries about this is that the pace is not being dictated by us, but by climate.
That's a fair comment. I guess in part it's you know, a feeling by some within Australia that if we're only 1.3% of global emissions, whatever we do as a single state is actually not going to make much difference. And the rest of the world doesn't understand that we're a resource-based economy, we've got a growing population, we've got a big geography, and therefore transport is carbon intensive, and so it goes on. You know, my response to that has always been, well, that might be true, but we can afford to be a leader, and if we don't take a lead, how can we expect anyone else to? But there hasn't been a sense of urgency in Australia. The Australian response has been rather, what is the global budget to achieve a certain outcome, which, a rise temperature less than 2%, etc. And what's our fair share? What burden can we fairly take to contribute to achieving that outcome, rather than a sense that maybe Australia should be the initiator, be out there creating a sense of leadership. And that's happened even though we've been through terrible bushfires of recent times and manifestations of a warming climate. But it still doesn't seem to have brought that, engendered that sense of urgency. On the side of business, I think they are responding to changing attitudes within the broader community. Their investors, their customers as it goes on. But perhaps I don't want. I know I'm in business too, and I don't want to be cynical, but sometimes the spin is a little different from the reality. I might say, John, I can remember the chairman of BP coming to Australia 20 years ago and saying BP stands for Beyond Petroleum.
Yep.
We're going to lead the world away from a carbon future. So since then, I've always been cautious when I hear these aspirational claims. And what Taylor, our minister, says, we're having the same experience at government in Australia when the pressure is now on to adopt a 50-year net zero carbon target. And Taylor's response is, well, I'm not prepared to do that until I know how it can be achieved. What are the policies and measures that would achieve it? Would they be affordable? Is it realistic? Where business sets a 30-year aspirational target, it's perhaps not under quite the same pressures as government.
But Britain has done exactly that. Before we agreed to the net zero target in 2050, the government asked the Climate Change Committee, could we do it, by what date, and what was the method? And we spent a long time producing what I think is acknowledged to be the best report either we've done or indeed one of the major reports of the world, showing that we couldn't do it before 2050, but we could do it by 2050. And here were the ways which we had to do it. And that detailed work, it's a very large report, but it was based upon the principle not of saying, I won't do it until I know. It was Mrs. May, I think, perfectly rightly saying, we've got to find a way to do it, but we've got to be realistic. So how soon can we do it? Because, there were all those people saying we've got to do it by 2030. And what she said was, in the end, it's a business. You have to find the way of doing it. So how do we do it by what date? How do we do it? And what does it cost? And that's exactly what we assessed. And the program is all built up to reach that end. And it was because it was a clearly thought out argument that Parliament was prepared to accept that. And I agree with you about business, but actually BP is a rather good example, isn't it? 20 years ago, it was all aspirational words from Lord Brown. Now BP has got a proper programme to reach the situation in which it is doing what it promised it would do then. It's taken them 20 years. But the question is, why have they changed? And the reason they've changed is that they have recognised the urgency of the matter. They've thought seriously about stranded assets. They have experienced a very low oil price, a price which is very low partly because of COVID, of course, but partly too because of the growing use of other ways of generation, a hugely increased amount of demand for reducing emissions and therefore of using less and being more efficient. And they've decided that if they want to be in business in 2050, the only way they can be is by being a non-fossil fuel company in the general sense. So, and you look at Shell and you look at what is British Gas and you look at a whole range of other people, they now do have real programs reaching towards that end because otherwise they get killed in Britain. If you're a business that says I'm going to do X and don't explain exactly how you're going to do it, you have the wrath of every non-governmental organisation, and you have the Climate Change Committee saying we'd like to see this and we'd like to go through it with you and we'd like to see whether you actually are going to be able to achieve it. So the whole principle is that it's very difficult to do greenwash at this level any longer. There's a lot of greenwash at other levels, mind you, but greenwash at this level is almost impossible.
So in Australia, most states have already committed to getting to net zero by 2050, but the federal government hasn't. So is it important to wait and have a much better idea of how to get there to then impose that net zero by 2050? But because generally speaking, we all know, and every climate model tells us that we must get to zero emissions by 2050, but there's flexibility on how to get there, and these technologies will keep changing. But if we don't set a target, will we get there anyhow, or by setting a target, are we saying it's going to be easier to get there because at least we know that we have to put a lot more effort towards, and maybe that's why the states are already doing it. But Robert, do you think it's necessary in Australia, since the states are doing it and taking the lead, is it necessary for the federal government to do it as well?
Well, I applaud the states taking these initiatives, provided that they've done the homework and have worked out how they can achieve what they're stating. I think that's the difference. When I used to represent Australia at the UN, we used to talk about the importance of having hard short-term targets and longer-term aspirational goals. What's happened in the intervening years is that aspirational goals are no longer sufficient, that we realise we don't have the time that perhaps we then thought we had. So the longer term goal has to become a target and has to be based by solid policy. Otherwise, it won't work. And so yes, I think that it will be difficult for Australia to get to a very demanding target, even in the long term, unless it is set in a longer timetable, and then do exactly what we have always done in Australia. When we went to Kyoto for the Kyoto negotiations, we had worked out what would be the policies and measures that we would need to implement to achieve a certain outcome if that was the target we were to be given. It's just exactly the same as to whether you're doing it for 10 years or whether you're doing it for 30 years. And I think it is important that government does that. I don't know whether they are. Taylor says that he is working seriously towards a long-term plan in terms of his technology roadmap, but whether they intend that to lead to a long-term commitment is still unclear. Taylor said, "I'm not prepared to make that commitment." Morrison hinted in the Pacific that maybe the government would. So I would encourage them to do that, because I think it'll actually then make it easier to achieve the goal within the time frame.
So John, things are better in the UK, but it hasn't been perfect. You've warned the UK government that whilst the UK has done well on decarbonising the energy sector, most other areas are not on track to meet the 4th and 5th carbon budgets, and both of which, of course, are statutory requirements. So can you tell us more about how these budgets might be reached, how the targets might be reached?
Well, the fact is that government has committed itself to improve its programme in order that it can do so. One of the things that is so important is that it's much cheaper to do it if you do it early. The more you put it off, the more expensive it becomes. We said originally that to meet the first target which we had, which was a 60% reduction in emissions, we thought it would take something between 0.5% and 2% of the GNP. we then discovered that when we went up to 80%, we could do it within the same budget because things had become cheaper and we'd done enough early on. Now we think we can reach net zero with the same budget. We haven't increased the budget because we think we can. We don't need to because of the reduction in cost of things like offshore wind and the like. You're perfectly right. There's a whole series of things the government hasn't done. This government has committed itself to do so, and of course it has to do so, because in the end, as I remind it, I won't take it to court, but there are lots of people who will take it to court, and I shall be the first witness for the prosecution. And I don't want to be that. That would not be a good idea, but I'd have to be if it isn't meeting the target. So in my view, it just means that it'll be more expensive for it to do it now than it would have been had they done it when they were supposed to do it, which was starting 5 years ago. But there we are. They will reach that. The big issue, though, for governments is that it's always easier to say this is not quite the right time. It could be done next year. It'd be much easier after the election. I mean, we've got to sort this out. And that's one thing. The second thing is we do benefit in Britain for not having, and I'm going to be frank about it, for not having the outrageous journalists that you have who keep on putting out into the atmosphere totally untrue statements. And frankly, Mr. Murdoch should be personally blamed for the work that he has been doing to allow people to lie and to put forward things which are just not true. Now, even the very right newspapers holding views which I don't approve of at all. I'm a passionate believer in Britain's membership of the European Union, for example, but even those newspapers have ceased to pretend that climate change isn't happening. And the reason they have is that actually we now have flooding of a sort we've never had before. The rain now comes down like the tropics, not like the soft, permanent rain that we used to have. The east of England, where I live, is now officially designated as a semi-arid area. We had so little rain this year that we're all struggling in our farms and our gardens. And what we don't understand ever is the way in which journalists in particular are willing to write off things like your bushfires, the realities of the change in the atmosphere, the fact that you've had to have a new colour in order to show the heights of temperatures because they've never been like that before. If you don't wake up to that, it seems to me very difficult to understand. So I just believe there is a great deal to be said about the misinformation that makes it impossible for many Australians to take seriously both the facts and the urgency. And some of those people, some of those journalists should be ashamed of themselves.
You want to comment on that, Robert?
Well, it's even caused a breakup of the family, I see.
Yes, absolutely.
There are other news sources in Australia that take a very different view to News Limited. But it is true. I think if you ask me, most Australians have got a pretty rational view on climate change. They believe it's real. They believe it's happening. They believe we need to respond. They may not sense the same urgency as you do, but they certainly expect Australia to respond. And in electoral terms, we've tended to get a divide between those. Well, it's been immediate economic consequences that might have a countering influence. So those who fear that the policy implementations would cause them to lose their jobs, for example, are out. Their sentiment is outweighed by those pressures. So anyway, the News Limited is News Limited, and we live with it, but we take our news from a range of sources.
Let's talk about COP26 then, which was postponed to November next year. You've both been involved in international negotiations around climate and environment at the highest levels. What do you expect from COP26 next year, and what does success look like to you, John? do you think that the US, well, it will depend on the leadership, what it will be, whether it will still be under Trump or whether Biden wins the election, but will that change anything for Australia in the sense that perhaps if Biden is elected, would Australian viewpoint going to the talks be a bit more likely to put a better plan for COP26, or that won't make any difference? And do you think that, what will be the role of China and the role of the other countries like Brazil?
Well, the international scene changes all the time. And of course, the very fact that this has been put off means that we won't be having COP26 kind of in the gap between the actual voting and the establishment of a new president. So previously, in an odd way, the United States was in a very odd position, because had it been the same president, we'd have had the same difficulties. But if it had been a new president, then we wouldn't have been in a position to have different policies, because that's the nature of that interim period that happens in the American system. So I suppose one can say that one of the few advantages coming out of COVID is that actually it was put off for a year, so at least we'll know by then where we are. Now, it's not for me to say what's going to happen in the United States. It's obvious that one hopes that a particular thing will happen in the United States rather than a continuation of the present system, not least because, again, as in his view about COVID, Mr. Trump appears to prefer to believe what would be convenient rather than to believe what the science tells him. So the climate change issue is really very serious, but rather like in Australia, very large numbers of states and cities are taking very big steps on this, and there's a considerable amount of movement in America. And of course, the American major corporations are again amongst the leaders. If you look at people like Coca-Cola, if you look at people, major banks, you just begin to see a whole change, because they are taking the whole thing seriously, largely because they've looked at the money and they've begun to see what the insurance industry is doing, and about the facts of the increasing bad and extreme weather and the effects of all those things. So they're beginning to be very much tougher, and Mr. Trump is not leading the big and progressive industries at all. So what will happen? My own view is that what would be a sign of success will be if people step up to the commitment stage, so they increase their commitments, so we get nearer to the level that we have to have. And I think there's a good chance of that happening in quite a large area, certainly with Britain and the European Union. The Chinese, of course, there's an overlay of this antagonism from the United States and from some of the actions that they themselves have done. But China is committed to fight climate change because it has recognized the terrible damage it's doing to China. And I'm fortunate enough to be joint chairman of an Anglo-Chinese joint scientific working group who advises both the British government and the Chinese government. The one example of that joint science advice. So I have high hopes that the Chinese will in fact see this as a necessary point for them to assert a leadership, which I'm afraid has in a sense been given to them by President Trump's removal from the whole issue. And so I would hope that we will see the European Union and China and a number of other countries operate together to make a greater commitment, and also to make that commitment more clearly and demonstrably being worked for, because it's a bottom-up system. The trouble with bottom-up systems is you do exactly as Robert says. You know, you get an aspirational target, and what you've now got to judge is how far you're moving towards that aspirational target. I hope also that we'll get rid of a number of very important but less central things, which at the moment, like the measurement and how you compare people and all those things, are matters which are quite important and we need to get right. You mentioned Brazil. I think Brazil is one of the saddest cases. The way in which the Brazilian government has now descended into, frankly, farce over the biggest issues. And the rest of the world does have to recognize that we are an interdependent global society. And for Brazil to be damaging all our climate by cutting down yet more of the rainforest is an international scandal. And it is very important that the whole world recognizes that. We can't live in a way which pretends that our nations, even if they are very big nations, can behave in a way which damages their neighbors. And that is precisely what Brazil is doing at the moment. And the rest of us should recognize it and make it clear to them. And I think we've got to bring this home to Brazil. But whether it's possible to bring it home to Mr. Bolsonaro is, of course, a more difficult project. But it still seems to me that Brazil started to set a really good example. Unfortunately, it's gone back from that under the present regime. But one hopes that that will change soon.
Robert, to you, what would be ideally, what would you like to see Australia bringing to the table to COP26?
So the delay of a year, I think, actually is a bit helpful to Australia. It gives the government a bit more time to work out what Angus Taylor is referring to as his long-term strategy, and the plan is to take that strategy to the COP. So that doesn't become a binding obligation on Australia, but at least that commitment forces us to think more about where we take this issue in the future. But the COP, I think the pressure will be on the COP for tougher targets. The problem is that even with the 2-degree temperature rise, the accumulation, adding the commitments of all states, it's not going to be achieved by the quantum of those commitments. So that in itself will provide a pressure. And then, of course, the science is urging that 2 degrees is too high, and that adds further pressure for states to dig deeper in effect. So I think that pressure will be on Australia. The Australian government is not planning to go beyond its 2030 target of -26 to -28. And under the current rules, it's not obliged to go back with another short-term commitment until 2025. But I think within what will be a spirit of a meeting that is demanding more than what has been delivered so far, there'll be quite a bit of pressure on Australia, and I don't think that's unreasonable. And I think we should use this next year well to work out exactly what we can contribute to help meet the global shortfall.
Okay. We have a lot of questions from the guests. But before I read them out, let me ask you something a bit more personal to both of you. John, what would you think was your greatest achievement for the environment? And is there anything you would have done differently?
I think the proudest one was when I was able to give the British vote in the European Union to create what was called the bubble. The European Union decided that we would meet our climate change commitments by those nations most able taking a bigger weight, so that those nations that were not as able could take a smaller weight while we were trying to do the transition. And that meant that for the first time, Britain took one of the heaviest loads, and that enabled Ireland to take a much lighter load. For me, that was hugely important from an environmental point of view, because that's the way we have to do things in a world basis in the future. Those who can do more in order to help those who find it much more difficult. But second, for historical reasons, it was a time in which I felt I made a small contribution to make up for the terrible behaviour of Britain in Ireland and that awful history of our treatment of the Irish. I've no Irish blood at all, but I feel very ashamed of the British behaviour in Ireland. And it gave me that opportunity. And I only got it because it was right at the end of a government. There wasn't anybody to tell me not to. And so I did it.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that with us, John. Your turn, Robert.
Well, I don't know, but I'd say in the climate change debate, introducing the renewable target legislation was probably something I'm proud of, because basically the renewable industry in Australia wouldn't exist today without it. And I'm now speaking from a state in Australia where we're 50% renewable, and a government of the same colour as mine, which is aspiring to 100% renewable energy in the not too distant future. So I think that was worthwhile. And also, if I get a second go, I'd say that the now much maligned Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which under which the government seized its foreign affairs powers to take on a real responsibilities in relation, for the first time, in relation to matters that were of national environmental significance, and for the first time actually gave the Environment Minister decision-making powers.
Thank you. Well, let's just start asking some of the questions. There's lots here on the Q&A. I have a question from Joyce Urchig. Do you think the new information around the potential for a jobs boom and the idea that for the same investment we can create more green jobs than fossil fuel jobs, that this might be a ticket to our MPs starting to move forward? And how does this affect a gas-led recovery compared to renewables? How do we get a unified response to all of this? You want to have a go, John?
Well, it seems to me that a gas-led recovery is to say we're not preparing for the future. We're going to do something which in the end won't work. So that's the first thing. If you were talking about carbon capture and storage and you had a mechanism whereby you could take the carbon out of the gas, that would be a different thing. I think that what is happening in Britain is a very different thing, which is that we are saying that if we want to future-proof our changes, then we get the green jobs. Certainly, if you look at the jobs we have created over the past 5 years, a very high proportion, the fastest growing area has been in the so-called green areas. And that's where the future is. And that's where we should be putting our money. And there's a great deal of opportunity to do that. If all we do is to shore up the systems which are going to go to the wall anyway, then we'll be back in the sort of world which we were when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in Britain. I mean, when she came to power, we were busy putting money into all sorts of things like shipbuilding and such like, where we knew actually you were just year by year spending money, keeping something going. We don't want that. We want it year by year spending money to develop things which are going to stand on their own feet and be part of the future. So if Australia wants a gas future, then it's carbon capture and storage first, so that you can use the gas without damaging the climate.
Robert?
Well, it's we always saw gas as a transitional fuel, basically between coal and renewables, and then domestically gas became more expensive, and the renewables started to assume the place that we thought gas would play, and so the base load power for Australia in the longer future, as coal-fired power stations are phased out, is more likely to be in renewables. If I'm not sure whether that answers the question. So I see a lot of job opportunities in renewables, which doesn't mean that that the rise of domestic gas prices in Australia hasn't been detrimental to Australian manufacturing industry, because it has, and that's I can understand why the government would like to address that, but I don't think gas is going to be the future in terms of base load.
Hmm. John, there's a question for you from Marcus McInnes. Where is the UK going to get its renewable energy in the future? From uranium?
Well, the present situation is that we are increasing the amount of energy we get from strict renewables, i.e. from offshore wind and from solar. The government has finally turned over its policy, which was a ridiculous policy by a Conservative government, and no shamed of it, of not allowing onshore wind, so that is the cheapest form of generation now. Onshore wind is cheaper than anything else. So we will begin to have more of that in those areas that want it, and there are quite a lot. So the basis will be energy from those sources. We've got a nuclear program. The Climate Change Committee is in favour of the nuclear program. We believe that it's a necessary part of the transition so that we move to nuclear in a sense, because we will be replacing the nuclear component that we have at the moment. And the reason for that is that there are moments when the wind doesn't blow, and there are moments when the light and sun doesn't shine. And therefore you need that sort of base load. It will be, I think, soon replaced by other mechanisms, which we are working on very hard. But at the same time, at the moment, we need nuclear. Then there's the other thing which we have a chance to do, which Australia perhaps doesn't, and that is that we are building a new pipeline from the Scandinavia so that we can use their hydropower. And there is a serious discussion now about whether we should be able to build a pipeline from Iceland to use their hot water as a means. Now, those are other ways of doing it. We are trying to do the whole gamut, but we have committed ourselves to take gas off the grid so that there won't be gas for generation by the early 2030s. And no new house after 2025 can be connected to fossil fuel energy. They have to use heat pumps, and there has to be a modern system. And so we are moving ourselves off all that. And as that happens, I think there will be some more nuclear building, but it will be relatively limited, and we will then move on to alternative mechanisms.
Thank you. And there's another question for you, John, from Greg Story. Has the electricity price increased in the UK during the period of introduction of renewables? And if so, how has it impacted the industry? If not, how was it achieved?
Well, the first thing is, one of the things I banned when I came to be chairman of the Climate Change Committee was the expression kilowatt hours. Now, the reason I did that is I don't know what a kilowatt hour is, in the sense that it doesn't mean anything to people. So we do all the calculations now in the sense of people's bills. What do they pay? Because that's what people know. And so the price of electricity is not the important thing. The important thing is, how much electricity do people have to use? So in Britain, because of the significant increase in energy efficiency, the truth is that people are paying less in their bills today. It's about, it would be 20% less, but they are also paying about 7% more towards the green changes. So they are in net position, they are better off. And that has been done by energy efficiency, largely, I have to say, by the standards which have been imposed by us within the European Union. One of the fears that we all have in leaving the European Union is that the pressures which come of getting up to the best rather than falling to the bottom will not be there. It is, of course, a very silly policy of Britain. It will do us a huge amount of harm. But the fact of the matter is, we are leaving the European Union. I just hope the pressures will go on for energy efficiency. So it is always, never talk about the price, always talk about what people are paying, because that's what they know about. They know how much their electricity bill was. There is a thing one has to admit about Britain, though, and that was that it was entirely wrong that we should pay for the introduction of renewables and offshore wind and the like from electricity bills alone. Because although 80% of the population have dual tariffs, in other words, they have both gas and electricity, there's 20% of the population has only electricity. And they tend to be among the poorest, and they have paid more, therefore, and that disproportionately more, and that was not a proper way. And I'm pleased to see that the Treasury is now completing a report to show how you make sure that the costs of transition to a zero economy will be fairly shared, because we do need a just transition. This is a socially important issue, and one which I'm determined to make sure that we contribute to.
Thank you, John. Robert, a question for you from Michael Warner. What is the motive power to drive along Angus Taylor's technology roadmap?
What is the motive?
Yes, behind the technology roadmap.
Well, you're asking me.
I'm not asking you, Michael Warner is asking you.
I can tell you what Angus's argument is. He believes that to achieve the longer term reductions in emissions that Australia, that is necessary for Australia to achieve, a large part of that is going to come through technological change. And therefore, he put out a discussion paper which sets out all of the alternatives, none of which are particularly surprising. Is engaging a public consultation process, listening to experts and so forth, and from that the government will determine its roadmap and be prepared to back it with money. So it's a sort of a logical, I can't remember whether Angus came out of Boston's or McKinsey's, but it's sort of a logical thought process for a person of that background. But in some ways, they're already backing the new technologies, in terms of we talked about renewables. Australia has significantly increased its renewables. Still a long way to go. We're up, I think the latest figures are now up to about 21%. But the government's backing the Snowy Mountains big battery project, which is highly innovative, going to cost a lot of money, but it will complement the continuing growth of renewables. Similarly, the so-called battery of the nation, which will be Tasmania, and the capacity to expand the hydro and also the pumped hydro part of the sector within Tasmania, and then a new transmission line. So we still have them in Australia between Tasmania and Victoria, so that those renewable energies can be transmitted to Victoria. So in some ways, they've already laid out their roadmap in terms of backing renewables, backing the complementary battery system, a commitment to the upgrades of the transmission systems that are going to be necessary to ensure that renewables, as they grow, can do so in a way that the grid is stable. But they're looking at all the alternatives, and again have even put money in upfront in areas, hydrogen, for example, waste to energy. They backed the first major waste to energy plant with government money in Western Australia. So most of the technologies, apart from dropping in nuclear and a few of those, are already being invested with public money to some extent in Australia. But I guess doing it as a study, involving a broader constituency, might give the government greater confidence that it's going to invest in the right areas in the future. And I think they would hope that, having had a public engagement, it'll bring public support for the choices they make.
Thank you. Wayne Smith from the Smart Energy Council is asking you, John, why do you think that Murdoch takes such a different approach in the UK? Is it because of the bipartisanship, or is it the bipartisanship a result of the less toxic media on climate change, and what came first?
Oh, I don't think it's a one after the other. I think it just simply is that the newspapers in Britain have recognized the generality of people's support for it. They quite rightly pick up sillinesses of the extremes. I mean, my desire is always to find myself too extreme for the very moderates and far too moderate for the very extremes. There's a place to be there to get the change that you want. And I think in general, the newspapers in Britain have taken the view that this is a scientific fact. It is not a suitable thing to try to fight this issue in a way which perhaps individuals have taken a different view elsewhere. There are individual newspapers that have taken a generally disbelieving line, and others which are less enthusiastic about some of the measures which have to be taken. That's absolutely true, but they are in a minority compared with the situation in Australia. And it is perfectly true that those newspapers here owned by Mr. Murdoch have been much more sensible. And that's a decision that they make. And I wouldn't like to try to understand the internal workings of News International, I have to say.
Very well. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Let me ask one from Patrick Fair here. We haven't touched on hydrogen. He's wondering, to both of you, what do you think of the proposed hydrogen economy? Is it worth the government backing the development of hydrogen as an industry?
So if you're asking me, you're asking, who do you want to go first?
You can go first, Robert. You
Okay.
started. Yeah.
No, green hydrogen can be an important part of the future, and in this part, I think Angus is right. Angus recognises it can be, but at the moment it's still too expensive. Therefore, with good science and technology, if ways can be found to bring the price down, that's a good thing all round. It provides a viable industry, and it also helps him reduce his emissions. And so he is supporting, that's why it's an important part of his roadmap, but it's very much linked to not just a question of identifying the opportunity, but finding the ways to bring the price down so that it can be a competitive contributor to a better outcome.
Well, we advised the government to spend money on hydrogen. We've got a major agreement with the government on the support for the hydrogen economy. The truth is that we have to find a way of being able to produce hydrogen without using enormous amounts of energy, and that's a matter of scientific work. And we're going to spend a lot of money on that research. And the point is, you have to jump from the point of saying it's too expensive to find out a way of how do you make it cheaper, which is what we've done with offshore wind. After all, when I ran an offshore wind company, we were talking about 200 units. The cost was, let's put it in simple terms, 200 pence for a unit. It's now down to 40 pence. That's what's happened in that time. Then how does that happen? Well, research with a market-based system. That you need to create a market, and so what we are doing are creating a market for hydrogen, which enables people to do the research, which enables people to see that there's an end point to that, and that they will really make money out of it. And my worry always on the hydrogen thing is that it's one of those things that we know is going to have to be part of our future. because we don't really have an alternative to hydrogen in certain technical areas, particularly in heavy industry. And it may be that we don't have an alternative to hydrogen in terms of heavy road vehicles. And therefore, this is really worthwhile expending money on. And we're doing it on the basis that Britain really should become a hydrogen hub and be a leader in this area. And I'm pleased that the government has taken that very clearly and very supportively. It's taken some time because we ought to have done it earlier, like so many things, but we are now on track for doing that.
Thank you. And I suppose last question from Howard Witt to John. Please tell us your view on obtaining international action using border adjustments or tariffs on goods from countries with no effective carbon price. Does it breach WTO rules, and would it work?
Well, I think this is one of the biggest issues. The fact of the matter is, it really goes back to the point I made about the attitude that the world should have to Brazil. The truth is that this is a global problem, and there's only the answers are global answers, and people by behaving badly are damaging my climate and your climate, and therefore there is a real issue about what the globe does about it. And I think it's worth at this moment just thinking about the remarkable intervention of the Pope, who certainly his Laudato Si is by far the best short introduction to climate change there is. And in it, he makes the point that climate change is the symptom of what we have done to the world. And that's what it is. It's the symptom of what we've done to the world. And if we go into a world in which many countries are behaving properly, they're seeking to change their attitudes, they're changing their businesses, they're changing their industry, they're doing all that, you really do then have to say, I think, that you can't allow people to import into those countries products which are damaging the world's climate. And you have to say that they have to pay their bit, their part towards the changes we have to make. And so people propose that we should have some sort of border adjustments. My own view is that it's a very difficult thing to do. It's an extremely complicated international concept, but it will begin in small areas, some things, some areas where it's necessary. The World Trade Organization, well, the World Trade Organization has had to come to terms with a number of things, and in the end, the World Trade Organization is the vehicle of its members. And if its members find that it is not possible to allow people to cheat, in fact, on what has to be done for the whole world, then individual countries will say it's part of our sovereignty to protect ourselves from people who aren't doing what's necessary to protect our climate. And we're so interrelated. I mean, a very simple point just to leave you with is this. 50% of the air pollution in Britain is blown across from the rest of Europe. And half of the pollution that we make is blown across to the rest of Europe. So the idea that we're kind of islands, even in Britain, who can run themselves entirely without connection with others is just not true. So we're going to have to learn ways of cooperation in order to stop the destruction of us all. And that's one of the problems that Mr. Trump faces. And you see, that's why his views are what they are, because you cannot carry out the isolationist policies in a world which isn't isolationable. We're not isolationable, and even Australia on its own, long way from anywhere in many ways, but still what it does is changing the climate for those little islands which are sinking beneath the sea. And it's no good. We just have to accept it. And if we don't accept it, then other nations are going to take retaliatory actions. I hope we won't get to that. I hope we'll all be sensible and do it ourselves and perhaps just defend ourselves against a few rogue nations.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I would like to ask Trent Zimmerman, the federal member for North Sydney, to wrap up and do the vote of thanks. Welcome, Trent.
Thank you, Christina.
And by the way, we were very excited to read your opinion piece on climate today at the SMH, and the timing couldn't have been more propitious.
Coincidental. That was in Fairfax. But thanks, Christina, for this opportunity, and what a pleasure it's been to be part of this discussion. And to both John, you, if I may call you that, and to Robert, just watching the chat line, I know that everyone who's online have really enjoyed and I think learned something from this. I should start by declaring a conflict of interest, because I did actually work for Robert Hill for 6 years, including the period that he was Environment Minister. And for a small fee, I'm happy to tell some embarrassing stories about Robert's time as Environment Minister. Oh, Christina, I see a $50 note in your hand, so I better tell one. But I am reminded, Robert, you're going to kill me for this story. I am reminded of your first visit to Lord Howe Island, which was a World Heritage Site, is a World Heritage Site. And we were staying in a lovely resort where everyone had their own cabin. And the locals put on a rather boisterous barbecue for us that night, during which a reasonable amount of liquor may have been imbibed. And I remember getting back to the resort at the end of that and Robert saying good night and going off to his room to get undressed. And Lord Howe Island being what it is, they don't have locks on the doors. And as I'm walking back to my cabin, I hear this shrill scream from a woman coming from Robert's cabin. Well, the problem was it wasn't Robert's cabin that he'd walked into. He'd started to get undressed in front of a complete stranger. But such is the peril of politics. But John, can I say that your chat tonight has been inspirational, and I have to say that we Australians don't like to concede anything to the Brits with good cause, and so I've sat here envying the fact that you've achieved the degree of bipartisanship you have across the aisle. But I have to say, probably more importantly, envy the accord that has been achieved inside the Tories on climate policy. I did actually wonder and was thinking, do I have to concede that there's something systemic about British parliamentary democracy which makes it easier and better than our own? But I keep on reminding myself of the rather unedifying debate about Brexit to console myself. So, but can I say that it has been an achievement, and the role of your council has played no small part in that development. I think that I do wonder, actually, I was actually wondering whether there might be just something in the fact that we have 3-year parliamentary terms and you have 5-year parliamentary terms, which actually makes a difference on some of these things. But we are different countries, and obviously the politics are a bit different as well. But can I say that I am a half glass full type of person, and I do detect and see a change both in the community and at the political level as well. And Australians embrace new technology with some passion, as we have the internet or credit cards or smartphones and so on and so on. And that's reflected in the fact that we do have the highest rate of acceptance of rooftop solar, for example, in the world. And we are excited about technological developments like that. So I think that we will increasingly see Australians and those they elect embracing what are the considerable opportunities for Australia if we get this right. I mean, we have been described as a potential powerhouse when it comes to renewable energy by one of our economists, and I think that that is true. And if you look at the potential post-COVID for the creation of jobs in the renewable sector alone, then that is exciting. My only fear in relation to the political debate in Australia actually at the moment, well, actually it's not my only fear to be honest, but one of my fears in relation to political debate in Australia is that a lot of our focus in the climate area is squarely on electricity generation. I would actually argue it's probably the sector that we're doing best in, and it is other sectors of emissions production where we are going to have to solidly turn our focus over the next couple of years. And maybe we focus on electricity generation because the answers are relatively more obvious than they are in other areas like agriculture, but they are going to be very important areas for us to tackle. So can I just conclude by starting where I began, and that's to say thank you to both of you for what has been both an enlightening and an entertaining discussion tonight, and to Christina and you and your team from C4C for putting on another great seminar. Thank you as well.
Thank you, Trent. We need more MPs like you in Australia, but I think the numbers are growing. And well, I hope everyone felt very energized tonight, and the passion that John brings in this area of environment is truly contagious. Thank you very much, John, for being with us here in Australia. And Robert, thank you so much for being such a good supporter. We hope that everyone enjoyed the event tonight and that you will join us again, because on the 2nd of September, like I mentioned, we're going to have two wonderful ladies, Theresa May with Gladys Berejiklian. So if you haven't joined C4C yet, please register on our database on the website, coalitionforconservation.com.au, so you can receive the invitations. I wish you all a great night and a good day for you, John, in the UK. And fingers crossed that we'll overcome this COVID crisis very soon so we can all see each other face to face again at some stage. And hopefully I'll see you in COP26, John. So good night to all of you.
Good night.
Stay safe and see you soon.